In the autumn of 1934, at a desk in an office on Cherry Street in Meriden, Connecticut, a company officer typed a short letter to a customer in Wisconsin, explaining that the gun plant had been sold on the 1st of June and that a $50 money order would still be honored. The plant was gone. The order stood. For roughly 70 years, the guns made in that building had been sold in catalogs printed across 3 continents as the old, reliable. 9 decades later, in a museum case in Fairfax, Virginia, 3 shotguns from that same plant sit under glass, insured together for a figure north of $5 million. One record closed the business as finished, the other reopened it as priceless. Both are correct. The paradox holds the whole story. A gun that could not keep its maker solvent outlived the maker, the market that killed it, and nearly everyone who ever doubted it. Subscribe, and the $5 million figure on those 3 guns gets its answer before this ends. The story begins in Meriden in 1832. Charles Parker was 23 years old, born on January 2, 1809, in Cheshire, Connecticut, the 11th of 12 children, in a family with nothing to spare. He had apprenticed as a button maker and then turned out coffee mills for a Meriden manufacturer named Patrick Lewis. And when he opened his own shop that year, he had $70 and a plant turned by a single blind horse walking a circle. The horse worked 12 years. In 1844, Parker installed steam power, the first man in Meriden to do it, and the coffee mills became hardware, and the hardware became lamps, vices, piano stools, and spectacles. His brother Edmund joined the year after and worked the business on and off for a decade. By the measure of the town, Parker was already an industrialist when the war arrived. The Union Army needed guns, and Parker's Machine Works, reorganized with partners as Parker, Snow, Brooks and Company, took a contract for 15,000 Springfield rifled muskets and produced 10,000 repeating rifles besides. The work paid. It also taught precision barrel work, breech fitting, the discipline of interchangeable parts. All of it entered the building on Cherry Street and stayed after the muskets stopped. Parker knew hardware, not firearms, so he hired the men who did. The gunsmith brothers William and George Miller came in to run the transition, and it was their breech-loading patent of 1865 that converted muzzle-loading muskets to cartridge guns and pointed the works toward the shotgun that followed. During the war, the Meriden shop also turned out Triplet and Scott repeating carbines, and the experience of building a repeater, a gun that feeds round after round without reloading by hand, sat in the institutional memory of the company. It would matter, decades on, that Parker knew exactly what a repeater was and chose not to build its future around one. By January 1865, Parker held majority control and renamed the firm the Meriden Manufacturing Company, and in the post-war lull he turned the barrel machinery toward a civilian target, a breech-loading shotgun for a country moving west. A word on that term. A breech-loading gun opens at the rear, the breech, to accept a self-contained cartridge, in contrast to the muzzle loader, which was charged from the front with loose powder and shot and a ramrod. The distinction was the whole future of the trade. Parker built for the future. The earliest guns carried an 1865 patent date and a stamp reading made by the Meriden Manufacturing Company for Charles Parker, and the first of them was sold under the line The Gun of 1866. Roughly 700 were made under that mark. They sold. In 1868, Charles brought in his sons Wilbur, Charles, and Dexter, and the shotgun operation took the name it would keep, Parker Brothers. Those first Parkers used what the trade called a lifter action, and the term deserves a plain definition because the whole early gun turned on it. A lifter action opens by way of a small lever or button set ahead of the trigger guard, which the shooter presses to raise the bolt that locks the barrels to the frame, freeing them to hinge down. It worked. It was also slow, and it dated quickly. A designer named Charles A. King left Smith & Wesson and joined Parker Brothers in 1874, and over the next quarter century he rebuilt the gun from the latch outward. King replaced the lifter with a top latch, a lever mounted on the upper tang and worked by the thumb, faster and stronger. Then he did the thing that mattered more. King designed the first Parker with no external hammers at all, the mechanism folded inside the frame, cocked by the act of opening the gun. He stayed for decades and earned a title in the trade, the father of the Parker gun, because the architecture he set down was still being built when the company died. King was not alone in the country, and he was not first to the idea. In Syracuse, New York, a gunmaker named Daniel Lefevre held a hammerless patent granted in 1880, ahead of Parker's own, and the race to own the hammerless double would decide which American name survived the century. Parker Brothers took its guns to the Centennial International Exhibition in Philadelphia in 1876, the first of a string of showings that ran through Melbourne in 1880 and 1881, Chicago in 1893, and New York across the middle of the decade that followed. The guns won notice. More than that, they began to set a standard other makers were measured against. The company built its advantage on a method that could not be cheaply copied. Every Parker was assembled from machine parts and then fitted by hand, filed and stoned to tolerances a machine of the day could not hold on its own, so that the barrels closed on the frame with the fit of a bank vault. The guns ran in a ladder of grades, from the plain Trojan at the bottom through a row of lettered grades to the A1 special near the top, the same action dressed in progressively finer steel, wood, and engraving. A buyer did not choose a different gun. He chose how much of the same gun's craft he could afford. The barrels told their own story. The costlier guns wore what the trade called Damascus, or twist steel, made by forging ribbons of iron and steel together and winding them around a mandrel, which produced a barrel patterned like watered silk and strong enough for the black powder of the day. As smokeless powder arrived at higher pressures, Parker moved to fluid steel, a single solid forging, and the watered pattern gave way to plain strength. The look changed. The fit did not. Parker also sized the gun to its gauge, fitting the frame to the shell it fired, from the heavy 8-gauge and 10-gauge duck guns down through 12, 16, 20, and 28, so that a small bore Parker felt like a small gun, and not a large one cut down. The system meant a bewildering catalog and a fitter's nightmare, and Parker ran it anyway because it was correct. The guns rode a boom. Live pigeon shooting and the clay target game that grew out of it turned the shotgun into a competitive instrument, and the shooters who won wanted the gun that would not fail them on the 200th bird of a long day. By the 1890s, Parker had stopped competing on price and started competing over the definition of the thing itself. The catalog printed a phrase that traveled into gun rooms on 3 continents. It called the Parker the Old Reliable, and for a generation of American shooters, the words and the gun were the same object. The claim was contested. In Syracuse, Daniel Lefevre had patented his hammerless action in 1880, United States Patent 229-429, and Lefevre built a gun many judged the equal of anything from Meriden. L.C. Smith built another. Ansley Fox later built a third and called it the finest in the world. The American double gun trade was a knife fight among a handful of names, and Parker's answer was not argument, but refinement. King and a colleague named James P. Hayes patented the mechanism that widened the gap, a selective automatic ejector covered by United States Patent 673-641, granted in 1901, which threw the fired shell clear on opening while leaving an unfired shell seated. A word on that. An ejector kicks the empty hull out of the gun as it opens, so the shooter is not picking brass from the breech by hand, and a selective ejector does it only for the barrel that fired. In 1910, Hayes reworked the cocking system again and cut the parts count, and the Parker settled into the form it would keep, essentially unchanged, to the end. The proof that mattered was not printed by Parker. In February 1885, near Cincinnati, a markswoman named Annie Oakley set 3 16-gauge Parkers on a table and loaded them herself, and against 5,000 glass balls, thrown from 3 traps at 15 yards, she broke 4,772 in under 9 hours. She owned Parkers by the dozen. Between her and her husband, Frank Butler, the couple kept at least 12. When a gun performs that in the field in a stranger's hands, the phrase "old reliable" stops being a slogan and becomes a measurement. The order books recorded the rest. A young Kermit Roosevelt received a 20-gauge Parker in 1903 at 14, a gun his family's papers still document. Zane Grey carried one. John Philip Sousa's name appears in the same ledgers. The guns went where the century's famous went, and they came back working. By the close of the 1920s, the running total had climbed toward a figure no American shotgun maker had reached, and the company decided to market with 3 guns unlike anything it had ever built. In 1930, Parker Brothers built 3 shotguns to mark the 200,000th gun to leave the works, and it called the grade the Invincible. There would be exactly 3. Each carried a gold single trigger, full engraving, and gold bird inlays, and when the grade was announced, it listed at $1,500, a record for an American-made shotgun, and more than double the price of the A1 Special or an imported Purdy. Those 3 guns went in time to a museum, and the last public reckoning put their combined worth past $5 million, which is the figure promised at the start and the plain answer to it. 3 guns, hand-built to mark a number, from a company 4 years from its grave. The gun had reached the end of its development. Through the 1920s, Parker had added the last refinements a double could take: a single trigger in place of 2, a ventilated rib raised above the barrels to cut heat shimmer and shave weight, a broad beaver tail forend to fill the hand. In 1924, a grandson, Charlie Parker, fitted the first Parker in .410 bore, the smallest shell the company ever chambered, and it reached the catalog by the second half of the decade. The line was complete. The firm was 98 years old and at the height of its name. The 200,000th gun was not a round guess. Parker's stock books recorded almost every gun it ever made by serial number, with the date each was started and finished, the grade, the gauge, the barrel length, down to the stock measurements, so the company knew to the unit what it had built. Across roughly 75 years, the total would reach near 242,000 guns, a figure still disputed by a few thousand either way. The flaw had been present the entire time, invisible, while the money was good. Parker made one kind of thing. It made a hand-fitted break-open double gun, the 2 barrels side by side, and it had built its whole existence on the proposition that a serious shooter wanted the finest example of that one object. A word on the alternative. A repeater is a shotgun that fires and then feeds the next shell from a magazine without the gun being broken open, whether worked by a sliding pump beneath the barrel or by the recoil of the shot in a self-loading action. It held 5 shells to the double's 2. It cost a fraction to build because it was stamped and machined rather than filed by hand. The repeaters came from the same state and the states around it. Winchester's pump-action model 1897 and the self-loading designs that followed from John Browning's patents, guns a working man could buy for a third of a Parker's price and never think about again. Parker had never made a cheap gun. None of its shotguns ever left the counter for under $50, real money in 1900, and a luxury by 1932, with the country 3 years into the Depression and the luxury buyer gone. Parker knew how to build a repeater. The Meriden works had turned out 10,000 repeating rifles during the war and a run of triplet and Scott carbines besides, so the knowledge was in the building's memory. The company chose the double anyway, and for 50 years the choice looked like conviction. In the 1930s, it looked like a trap. A firm that sold one expensive thing to one shrinking class of buyer had no second product to fall back on when the first stopped selling, no military contract to carry it through a lean decade, no cheap line to keep the lights on. The moat that kept the competition out also kept Parker in. The consequence was physical, and it sat on the workbenches on Cherry Street. A Parker took a skilled fitter hours of filing and stoning to bring the barrels to bear on the frame, and those hours were the gun, and those hours could not be cut without killing the thing that made it the old reliable. At a hardware counter in a Midwestern town in 1932, a man with $30 could walk out with a Winchester pump that would kill birds for 40 years, or he could set the same $30 against the price of a Parker and still owe the balance. The arithmetic did not care about craftsmanship. It rarely does. In September of 1934, a customer in Madison, Wisconsin, sent $50 for a GHE grade Parker, gun number 235196, for his son. The name on the order was Leopold. The letter that answered it, dated the 27th, thanked him, confirmed the gun, and mentioned in passing that the company had sold the gun plant that June and was no longer in the gun business. The buyer got his gun. The maker was already gone. The sale that ended 80 years of Parker guns had closed on the 1st of June, 1934, and the name had 4 more years in Meriden before it left Connecticut for good. On the 1st of June 1934, the Charles Parker Company sold the gun plant and the Parker trademark to Remington Arms, a firm many times its size that wanted a high-grade double of its own and the reputation attached to it. The price was never made public. Production stayed in Meriden at first, and for 3 years the guns coming off the line carried both worlds in them, Meriden fit and Remington oversight. Roughly 4,500 of these transition guns built between 1934 and 1937. In December of 1937, Remington closed the Meriden plant and moved the operation to its own works in Ilion, New York, and the move carried the machinery and fewer than 20 workers. That number is the whole story of the decline. A Parker was not a set of drawings, it was a set of hands, the fitters and filers and stockmakers who had spent careers learning where to take a half-thousandth of steel off a particular surface. And most of those hands did not follow the work to New York. They retired in Connecticut. The knowledge retired with them. The Ilion guns were fewer, and to the men who knew Parkers, not quite the same. No single decision wrecked them. The gun degraded the way a language degrades when its last fluent speakers stop teaching it, one lost nuance at a time. Remington built perhaps 6,000 Parkers in all before the account closed. In 1942, the United States entered the war. Remington turned its capacity to military production, and civilian shotgun work stopped. A handful of Parkers trickled out of Ilion in the years just after. The last of them, dated by some records as late as the middle of the decade, but the line was effectively finished. 80 years of Parker guns ended not with a closure notice, but with a wartime reallocation of machine time. What remained was the plant on Cherry Street, and it did not remain long. In 1970, a fire took the complex, every major building of it, and left standing a single structure, the old office. That office is the last surviving piece of Parker Brothers on the ground in Meriden. The trademark had a stranger afterlife. Filed again in 1979 and 1981 by later owners hoping to revive the name, it was abandoned at the patent office by 1999, unused. The guns did not burn, and they did not stop working, and by the time that office wall was the only Parker left in Meriden, the market had begun to say something the company never lived to hear. In 2021, a single Parker, a 20 gauge in the AAHE grade, sold at auction for $207,000, and the 3 Invincibles sat insured past $5 million. The verdict of the market was in, and it was the opposite of the verdict of 1934. Both verdicts are still worth leaving open. A company can die because the market turned, or because it refused to turn with it, or because the very thing that made its product excellent, the hours of a skilled hand, priced it out of the century it had to sell into. Parker was killed by the Depression, or by the repeater, or by its own craftsmanship, and the records support all three. The terms are on the table. This morning, somewhere along a flooded timber edge or a grouse cover in the northern hardwoods, a Parker is being carried by someone whose grandfather carried it first. The barrels close on the frame with the same vault. Fit a man on Cherry Street filed into them 100 years ago. The gun works. It was sold once as the old reliable, and the word turned out to be true about the steel long after it stopped being true about the company that stamped it. The rival waited out west in Syracuse the whole time. The man whose hammerless patent beat Parker's to the record by 2 years, who built a double that hard, judges called the equal of anything from Meriden, and who watched his own name pulled off his own guns and sold to men who had never bent a file. He built one of the finest guns almost nobody remembers. His name was Daniel Myron Lefevre. The record continues.